Hi folks, this is another Camtasia video that I'm going to be doing. This is lecture 6 for Econ 102 International Trade. I hope to have this completed and posted to you shortly. So normally this is where I'd ask students if they had questions, but obviously we're online, so that's not exactly possible, so I'll just skip through that. Trade is actually a big issue, and by the way, you'll notice that some of these articles are current or are fairly current, and some of them go way, way back. So when it comes to economic issues, trade, for whatever reason, seems to have an outsized influence. This one is talking about U.S. tariffs that were imposed on China and South Korea. And it came at a time when I guess Trump was upset that China and South Korea were sending so many products to the United States. He doesn't seem to view a trade deficit as being something that's normal. I mean, we do have big trade deficits, but it doesn't mean that the people that sell more to us and buy from us are doing anything unscrupulous. Nonetheless, he didn't like that, so he imposed tariffs on solar panels coming from China and washing machines coming from South Korea. And this came at a time when he needed China and South Korea's help with North Korea, because North Korea is trying to make nuclear weapons and missiles. This is another article. This actually goes back to the election between Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. I thought this is kind of interesting because Mitt Romney was saying that Obama wasn't doing enough to stop China from subsidizing certain products. There's an organization called the WTO, the World Trade Organization. China joined the WTO in 2000, and when they did, they agreed to abide by all the rules and regulations laid out by the WTO. And the WTO prohibits, one of the rules and regulations that they have is that they prohibit countries from subsidizing their manufacturers. Now, the reason I thought this is kind of an interesting article was because if you know anything about Mitt Romney, he's got a lot of factories, or his company, Bain Capital, has a lot of factories operating in China, and it wouldn't surprise me if one of his factories is actually receiving some of these subsidies that he's accusing Obama of doing nothing about. This is another article. This one actually goes back to, I think it was 2006 or something like that. This is right after President Obama. No, it would have to be after 2008. Right after President Obama got elected, one of the things that he did was he announced tariffs on tires coming from China. Now, a lot of times people would say, oh, this must be because American tire makers don't want the extra competition. It turns out that the same people who make tires here in the United States own the factories that make these tires in China. And they didn't really care one way or another, because if they make the tires here, they make the tires in China, they're still going to sell them in the United States. So what Obama did was he imposed a 4% tariff on all tires coming from China and a 35 to 55% tariff on the least expensive ones coming from China. Now, the people who are behind this were actually the tire workers, U.S. tire workers. Tire production is concentrated in Ohio. If you know anything about U.S. politics, Ohio is a swing state. It's a very important state for a presidential candidate to win, and the tire workers in Ohio helped President Obama carry the state, so of course they wanted something back. And that was a tariff on tires coming from China. Now, what I find really interesting is this 35 to 55% tariff on the least expensive tires is, of course, going to hurt the lowest income people, because if you think about it, it's the lowest income people that are most likely to buy the least expensive tires. So they're going to see the price, or they did see the price of their tires go up quite a bit. This is an article that goes back to 2005, and it says that Japan payback with U.S. steel levy. So let me explain what happened here. In the 1980s, Japan was a dominant steel producer, and a lot of U.S. steel makers were accusing Japanese steel makers of dumping. Now, what is dumping? Dumping is when you sell at less than cost. We're getting into the whole cost section. That's, I think, lecture 10. So the only thing I'll say right now with respect to cost is that there are many different kinds of cost. You have average total cost, you have marginal cost, you have average variable cost. There's a whole bunch of different costs. And what American steel makers were saying was, look, Japanese steel makers sell steel in the Japanese market at a higher price than they do in the US, and that must be a sign that they're selling at below cost. Well, you wouldn't make any money if something cost you $1 to make and you sold it for 80 cents. I mean, you'd be losing 20 cents on each one of those that you make. So that doesn't seem like a good strategy. Now, what the US steel makers were saying is the Japanese are doing this on purpose because what they want to do is they want to drive out US steel, drive out that production. And then once they have the market all to themselves, they would be able to raise prices. Well, this case went to the WTO. The WTO found in favor of Japan, and the reason they found in favor of Japan was because they didn't find any evidence of dumping. What the Japanese steelmakers were doing is they had a monopoly. They had a protected market in Japan. They had a monopoly on steel production in Japan. Other steelmakers couldn't export into the Japanese market, so they could therefore charge a higher price to people who use steel in Japan. And because they wanted to enter a more competitive market like the United States, they were forced to come in at a lower price. That doesn't mean they were dumping. That just means they're charging two different prices in two different markets, and that's not against WTO regulations. All right, this one, I think this is the final article. Arbitrator issues award in banana dispute. So let me set this up for you. The European Union imposed tariffs on bananas coming from Central and South America because they wanted to protect bananas that were grown in their former colonies in Africa. The banana producers in Central and South America, with the United States on their side, brought this case to the WTO. The WTO found in favor of the Central American and South American banana producers and told the EU that they can't do that. That goes against regulations. This case is far from settled, even though this is back in, I think, 2005 or so. It's still getting delayed. And I'm under the impression that it still hasn't even been settled right now, and we're in 2019. Now, why did the United States get involved in a banana dispute? Well, if you know who the banana producers are, they're American companies. I mean, they're banana plantations maybe in countries like Costa Rica and Panama and Ecuador and countries like that, but they're American companies. You know, Dole, Chiquita, those are United Fruit. Those are all American companies. And so, when there's a dispute like this arises, the U.S. would obviously come in on the side of the U.S. banana producers in Central and South America. All right, so what does the United States trade? These are broad categories of items that we export and import. And one of the things you'll see is that we tend to import and export the same kind of products. Now, we run in these broad categories of profits deficits in most of them. One, I guess, bright sign, if you want to look at it that way, is agriculture and forest products. We actually have a trade surplus in that, but we have deficits in chemical and energy products, textiles, apparel, and footwear, minerals and metals, electronics, machinery, and transportation. So then the question is, why would we export the very same kind of products we import? And a lot of that has to do with maybe we have a comparative advantage in producing a certain type of thing, but we don't have a comparative advantage in producing some other type of thing. So, I mean, for example, textiles, apparel, and footwear, you can see that we export about $23 billion. These are all in millions of dollars. $23 billion worth of textiles, but we import 147 $1 billion. Well, why is that? Because these things, textiles, apparels, and footwear, require a lot of labor, and we don't have a comparative advantage in the United States, right? Our labor rate is very expensive compared to labor in other countries, so it stands to reason that we'd be importing a lot more than we'd be exporting. Let's see, our top 10 trading partners. This is in order. By the way, this has changed. It's interesting with all the tariff issues that we have with China, all the trade issues we have with China, where Trump has recently been imposing higher tariffs. It turns out that Mexico is now our biggest trading partner. Now, it wasn't that long ago that China was actually behind Canada and Mexico. Canada used to be our largest trading partner, imports and exports, followed by Mexico. Then China overtook Mexico. Then China overtook Canada. And now you'll notice this is 2017. For this year, Mexico is actually number one, is our number one trading partner. But it's mostly these same 15 countries over time. The order might change a little bit, but China, Canada, Mexico, Japan, Germany, South Korea, the UK, France, Italy, India, Taiwan, Brazil, Netherlands, Ireland, and Switzerland. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is you have 15 out of 200 and some odd countries in the world, and these 15 countries account for about 75% of the total amount of trade. All the other countries in the world account for the other 25%. So we tend to trade with just a very small number of countries. We do a lot of trade with them, but they tend to be small. Now, in the case of China, you'll notice that yes, we import far more from China than we export. That's the thing that's driving Trump bonkers. With respect to our other trading partners, the trade deficit is not quite so bad. But just because a country runs a trade surplus with another country doesn't mean that the country that's running the deficit, the one that's importing more than they're exporting, is somehow getting ripped off. But I guess that's kind of a hard sell for Donald Trump to. That's kind of a hard concept for him to understand, I guess. Okay, so how is trade determined? It's by comparative advantage. So what would give a country a comparative advantage? Some things could be like natural resources. So one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia exports so much oil is because they have so much of it and it's so inexpensively available. Another source of comparative advantage should be something like climate. We export a lot of food products that grow in a temperate climate. So we export things like corn and wheat and soybeans. They tend to do well in the kind of climate that we have, but we import food that is grown in tropical climates, things like bananas and coffee and pineapple and sugar and stuff like that. So countries that have let's say, a tropical climate would have a comparative advantage in the production of those kind of crops. Another source of comparative advantage that's pretty interesting is that certain countries have figured out a way of developing specialized industries. So, for example, it wasn't that long ago that 85% of the world's laptops were made in Taiwan. So somehow Taiwan had developed a comparative advantage in the production of laptops. Today, if you look at a country like South Korea produces a lot of consumer electronics. They're also producing things like cars and washing machines. So, what they've done over time, because they weren't always known for, let's say, the quality of their TVs or the quality of their washing machines or refrigerators, over time they've developed these specialized industries. They became really good at making those kind of things. Another source of comparative advantage would be having other kinds of abundant resources. So, for example, labor. One of the reasons that China makes so much in the way of textiles and cheap toys and clothing and footwear and stuff like that is because those things are all very labor intensive. They have a very big population. They have even today a big population that is underutilized. I mean, if you go into the interior of China, you can find workers that'll work for very little. And so if you're willing to put up a factory, let's say somewhere in the interior, you might be able to get those products made with inexpensive labor. The things that we produce here in the United States rely a lot on capital, either human capital or physical capital. So they would be the kind of products that we export to other countries are things like pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals require a lot of human capital. If you think about people who are working in a lab on a pill or a vaccine or something like that that cures something or treats something, that takes a lot of people who are very well educated, PhDs in bioscience or biochemistry or what have you. All the other things that we export are things that require a lot in the way of physical capital. So, for instance, Airplanes, Boeing is either number one or two, even with its problems right now, in commercial airplane production in the world. If you want to make big airplanes, that requires a lot of physical capital. Or another example of a big exporter, U.S. exporter, would be Caterpillar. Caterpillar makes heavy equipment, things like bulldozers and backhoes, all that yellow equipment you see by the in a construction zone. A lot of that's made by Caterpillar, and they export to other countries. And of course, those kind of things require a lot of physical capital to make. Or again, natural resources. If you have a lot of a natural resource, then you could be able to export those as well. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this one here, and then we'll get into the world price, how the world price for a commodity is determined. Thanks a lot, and I'll get this posted shortly.